Republicanism, as a set of political ideas, is one of the most important contributions of the Romans to the history of law and justice. And one of the most important theorists of republicanism is in fact not a philosopher, is not even a political thinker per se, but rather a historian, Livy. Livy is one of the classical authors. He writes in Latin, and he is famous for his history of the Roman Republic, called the Ab Urbe Condita, the history of Rome from the time of its founding, a sweeping history which only survives, sadly, fragmentarily. But nevertheless, even in this fragmentary form, has been one of the most influential political works in all of history. Livy, he's a historian, but he thinks like a political philosopher. And his history, his account of the experience of the Roman Republic, is one of the great storehouses of Republican philosophy. And indeed, it would influence political thinkers throughout the centuries, especially, as we'll see, Niccolò Machiavelli, who would revive republicanism as a sort of political ideology. Livy's history recounts for us the age of the monarchy, the age of Rome under the rule of kings. And Livy's history tells for us the overthrow of the kings. And the way that Livy tells the stories has within it a type of political philosophy that embodies the values of Roman republicanism. Livy's history of the Roman kings ends with the account of the reign of King Tarquin, a king that would come to be known as Tarquin the Proud, Tarquinius Superbus, Tarquin the Arrogant. And there's an idea in republicanism that power itself is dangerous. Now, the seeds of this are in fact to be found in Aristotle's political science, in the politics itself that we've studied. Aristotle studies the nature of power and political change. It's there in germ. But in Roman republicanism, we see expressed even more powerfully and clearly and articulately the idea itself that power has certain tendencies and that humans will tend to corrupt under the influence of power. And the Romans believed, and Livy believed, that the monarchs, the kings of Rome, were necessary, but that ultimately this kind of power was dangerous. And fear of power itself is an inherently republican concept. The last of the kings of Rome was Tarquin, and during his reign, the Romans began to receive ominous signs from the gods. And so they dispatched an embassy to the oracle of the god Apollo at the Greek temple of Delphi. The embassy included two sons of the kings and a son of a Roman nobleman, a man named Brutus. And his very name means something like dullard or the slow-witted. And they went to seek an oracle from the god, and Brutus took with him a gift for the god, a wooden rod, which inside it secretly had concealed a rod of gold. It was symbolic of his nature, Livy said, that behind the dull-witted exterior, Brutus concealed an interior of gold. And the Romans came back, and later they were laying siege to a town not some 25 miles from Rome itself, Ardea. And that in itself is revealing. At this time, Romans are no more than a few thousand men. They're at war with a city that's just down the street. In Oklahoma, it would be as if Norman or Edmund were fighting. In fact, it wouldn't even be that illustrious. It would be more like Lindsay versus Washington, a few thousands versus a few thousands. And one night, the men laying siege to this city, the Romans, were sitting around their campfires, and as the men began to drink their wine, as they do around the campfires, they began to brag about the virtue of their wives. And it turned into a drunken contest of who had the most virtuous wife. And the young men said, well, you know what, we're only 25 miles from home. Why don't we hop on our horses and go see what our wives are doing right now in the middle of the night? It may have been a bad idea. They went from house to house, and every house they found that the women were misbehaving by ancient standards. They were partying, they were interacting with other men, and the Romans were shamed, even the princes of the city, except for one woman, a woman named Lucretia. She was there, and this is virtuous according to Roman standards, locked inside of her bedroom, weaving, just as the Romans expected women to do. She was virtuous, and her husband was proud of her that he had the most virtuous wife of all the young Romans. And so they went back to their camp. But among the Romans who had seen this was one of the princes, one of the king's sons. And in that image of virtue, he conceived a profound lust that he was unable to conquer. And he would ride back to the house of Lucretia, would break into her house, and would tell her that he expected her to have sex with him, and that if she refused, that he would kill her, slit her throat, kill a slave, and put the slave, a male, in bed with her, so that it would look as though she had betrayed her husband and been caught in the act. And so she's forced to submit to the prince of the city. This is a terrible story, and Livy tells it. It's part of the Roman mythology, and it's meant to make you hate the kings and the king's family. The idea behind the story is profound. The idea that power itself corrupts, that humans are creatures with desires and wants, and that when those desires are combined with power, that it's a dangerous combination, inevitably dangerous. The young woman who'd been violated, Lucretia, sent word for her husband to come back to their house, and he came with his father and with his friend, Brutus, and she recounted to them what had befallen her. And she grabbed their sword and said that she would not be able to live, that her body had been violated. And she took the sword and fell upon it, killing herself. Lucretia would be famous as an example in Roman history. But what happened next was even more influential. Brutus, standing there, witnessing it all, took the sword out of her body, still steaming with her blood. And he raised the sword and swore an oath upon it that he would overthrow the king or die trying, and that the Romans, so long as he was alive, would not live under the power of kings. He had his friends standing there take the same oath, to swear to overthrow the kings and never again to live under the power of a king. The men marched back to the camp, and there, in the camp, all of the Roman soldiers took an oath that they would overthrow the king and refuse to live under the power of a single sovereign. There in the army camp of the Romans, they declared that they were independent from their king and that they would never again submit to monarchy. Livy says that this is the moment when the Republic was born. Imagine it, the Roman men in their camps overthrow their king, and most extraordinarily, they vote, they hold an election. The soldiers themselves hold an election to elect an executive. And they elect not a king, but a consul. A consul. And this would become the most important magistrate in the Roman Republic. Not just one consul, however, but two. Two consuls. Two executives with chief executive power who would rule simultaneously, who would be elected, and who would hold one-year terms. And that would be the essence of the Roman consulate throughout the rest of its history, that there would be two rather than one, that they would be elected rather than inherited, and that they would hold power for a specific term, 1 year. The consulate, this institution, this kind of executive office, would hold the exact same powers of a king. That is, that the executive powers themselves were the same. It's not that the government had any less power. It's that it was organized in a way that would inherently limit it. Individuals would be elected, they would hold office 2 at a time, and would hold office for a specific term. The power was the same, but it was distributed in a way that would prevent it from accumulating and would prevent it from corrupting. Livy says this is the moment the Republic is born. This is the moment when Roman liberty, Roman libertas, began, when the Romans overthrew their king, and the men at camp declared that they would rule themselves instead.